Some of you know that Sarah and I are in this season of parenting where we have 3 boys, 8 years old or under, which means that if left untended, our house can become a boneyard for broken objects. And so one of our favorite family traditions that our boys only sometimes know about is every Thursday or Friday going through the house with a garbage bag and trying to figure out what we can fix, like what's easy enough to fix, or what would be better thrown away. In the last year, we found a broken window pane in our house. We found about 20 broken remote control cars. We found 10 disassembled Nerf guns. And when we asked our boys why they were disassembled, they said they were re-engineering them so they would, quote, shoot harder. All kinds of things broken in our house. But enough about me. I kind of want to hear about your garbage. And so since you've already turned to each other in the pew this morning, I'm going to have you do this again and share with your neighbor one broken thing you've found in your house recently. Okay, one broken thing. I'm going to ask you to shout these out in just a minute. Okay? Okay, that sounds like a lot of garbage. Sounds like a lot of broken things. Shout out, what did you hear or what did you say? What's broken in your house? Cups, mugs, dangerous. Okay. Doors? Violent, okay. Trash can. Oh my gosh, trash is trash. What else? One more time. Oh, electronics. This is very sad. I think all of us end up at some point in our home ownership journey or just in our life at all ages come into contact with like all kinds of things that are broken. And what I notice is even those of us who have the most plentiful junk drawer don't love the idea of broken things staying that way. And our scripture passage for today is about what God does with broken things. In your pew, so kids have these in their fun packs, but adults, these are at each end of your pew. There is carbon copy paper, okay? Children of the 80s, you've never felt so seen. You already know what to do with this, but at the end of your pew, if you can, pass these down your pew. There's carbon copy paper. If anybody doesn't have these, raise your hand and we'll sort of try to distribute these, okay? Friends in the back over here, if you can pass these around. What I'm gonna invite you to do throughout the sermon today is actually to outline what we're talking about on this carbon copy paper. You're gonna need to draw on the white side. It should bleed through to the yellow, okay? Right now, as you get the paper, what I'm gonna invite you to do is to draw a line down and a line of cross, okay? So there's a template here on the screen. There's also a cross behind me, so you can use either one as your template. And what I'm gonna invite you to do is throughout the sermon to either draw or to write with specific prompts. Okay, so in the top left space, I'm gonna ask everybody to draw where you see brokenness in your life. Another way of saying this would be what in your life right now makes you sad? What feels heavy in your own personal life right now? Draw that in the top left quadrant as I'm talking. And if you don't want to draw, you can just write words if that's more natural for you. But in the top left, write about or draw about what makes you feel sad. Maybe there's a relationship in your life that feels broken right now. Maybe when you go to school or to work, you feel really nervous or you have a lot of dread. One of our JCB students, Katie, drew a moment of grief and loss in her own life as she mourned a family pet. You can see that picture up there in the top left. Whatever it is, as I'm talking, I'm going to invite you to draw something in your own life that feels sad right now. When we walk through the Bible, we can see a lot of stories of people that God raised up to deal with the broken things in their lives and the lives of the people around them. So just in the Old Testament, in Genesis, we see Joseph being raised up to save his family. In Exodus, we see Moses raised up to save his people from Egypt. In Esther, we see this queen who stands up for her people when the empire is about to kill them. We see the prophet Jonah sent to invite people to turn away from sinfulness that leads them to even more brokenness. And these are just a few of sort of the Jesus Storybook Bible highlights of the Old Testament. But you sort of get this picture, right? God promises his people that he'll put things right, and then he sends people, sometimes people we wouldn't expect, at just the right time to rescue and deliver and get things back on the right track again. And then we get to the New Testament, and the authors of the New Testament are trying to help us know that Jesus is sent as the ultimate deliverer, the one who's finally going to put things right once and for all. And the apostles are sent to carry this rescue, the news that God has delivered his people for all time, to the rest of the world. In other words, church, if we believe what the people who wrote the New Testament are trying to convince us of, we're living right now in the fulfillment of God's promises to all generations. And as I've been reading Revelation this week and soaking that in, I keep wondering, why doesn't it feel like it? In an era, if we're living in an era of fulfilled promises, why is it that we don't feel more fulfilled? Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about Revelation and how it's not just a book of like future predictions as to how the world's going to end, but it's a window into what God's doing in the present. And so we're left wondering, I think, if we believe that, how to make sense of the idea that God's making all things new even now, at the same time as there's brokenness and chaos around us. How can we believe, in other words, that God is even now putting the world together when it seems to us like all the world is falling apart? I'm going to invite you now to turn your attention to the bottom left quadrant of that XY axis that you drew. And in the bottom left corner, I'm going to ask you to draw a picture or write some words that depict something in the greater world that feels broken to you, something that makes you wish God would fix it. Ask one of our 7-year-olds in Splash to draw a picture of something that he wishes God would fix, and he drew this. A picture of a child who was born in another country and who worries that he's not going to be welcome to call this community his home. And I've sat with that picture a fair amount this week, partly because it's just heartbreaking, and partly because it's reminded me that at any age, we all run into things that we wish God would make right, that seem beyond us. And so I'm going to invite you to draw or write about what comes to your mind when you pray, Lord, have mercy. What do you wish God would fix? It could be unkind words that you hear people say to each other. It could be fighting or bullying that you or someone else experience. It could be people who don't have access to food or medicine that they need. What seems broken to you? As you draw, I'll tell you, I've wondered for a long time how God would fix the things that seem broken in the world. And for the longest time, my theology of God's recreative work was mostly formed by the Left Behind books. So from ages 9 to 14, I was getting saved every night, making sure I was devoted enough that when God came to beam his children up without their clothes for some reason and wipe everything else out, I would float up to heaven while God scrapped the rest of the broken world, because I assumed that God is like me, that when something is too hard to fix, he throws it away. But I want to call your attention back to our passage this morning, to the language that John uses when he writes about the way that God makes things new. Look at the words from John this morning. John writes, "Look, God's dwelling place is among the people, and he will dwell with them. He'll move into the neighborhood and wipe every tear from their eye. Mourning and crying and pain, death and everything that feels like death will be gone." everything will be made new. God's approach to the things that are broken in our world, in our country, in our neighborhood, and in us isn't to throw them away and give up. It's to move in and repair. God sees all the brokenness of the world that we do, and I think because he's God, he has an even better perspective and vantage point than we do. And yet, rather than recoiling in disgust, rather than lunging forward in anger, rather than judging from a distance, God renews things by coming close enough to wipe every tear from every eye of those who are mourning. God renews things by getting involved and by repairing even those things that feel most hopelessly dead and broken down until everything that feels like death is given new life. And as I've been reading Revelation this week, church, I think a whole lot of the good news from this book is found in precisely that truth. Because what that means, church, is that when you're broken, God doesn't want to throw you away. I wish all of us were able to let that soak into the core of our consciousness about what God's like. I've grown up in holiness traditions, Wesleyan churches, which means I've been around for most of my life a good number of try-hard Christians who really want to get things right. One of the things I keep noticing in us is that we tend to carry around this belief that somehow God is surprised by our brokenness, that God's disgusted by our brokenness, or that God's intimidated by our brokenness. And so often in these congregations, we won't admit our brokenness out loud because we feel like that would make it more real. And so we play a game that I think is just about as old as the Garden of Eden. We feel shame and we blame others or excuse our behavior away, and then we hide because to admit the places that we feel broken feels too big and too costly and too scary. And so eventually we become so good at hiding that our souls are about as dark as our secrets. And that's not something I want to pass on to the next generation. I wish that every child in our church would grow up with a belief that when we're broken, when we're at our lowest, whether because of something that's been done to us or something that we've done, we feel caught in a cycle of things that feel like death. I hope the next generation of this church knows that God's deepest desire isn't for us to hide, but to heal. I wish some of us grown-ups could learn it too. So many of us are walking around with wounds that are hidden but still bleeding. Too many of us struggle, I think, to find a small group or to pray or to read scripture or to get into spiritual direction or to find a therapist because we feel that our brokenness disqualifies us from the very grace we would need in order to heal. I wonder what would happen if there was a whole congregation of people somewhere, maybe here, who came to God knowing that they didn't have to be impressive because God's not interested in standing back and being impressed by our credentials so much as God is interested in drawing close and being near to us in love. God may be the great physician, church, but he is not in the business of cosmetic surgery. God's not trying to work on you in order to make you look better. He's working on you in order to make you be better. God's not interested in working to make you look holy. God's interested in making you actually holy. Because God's deepest longing isn't for brokenness hidden. His deepest longing is for brokenness healed. So as we keep walking through this passage, I'm going to invite you to return to your paper, this time for a testimony. I'd love for you to remember and draw or write in the top right quadrant, where have you seen God working and healing in your own life? This could be an inside healing. I think some of you have faced worry about something and God helped you find calm. Some of you, I know, have overcome addictions and finally found freedom after years of being in bondage. This could be an outside healing. I've heard stories from this church of people having diagnoses that felt like they could only lead to death and finding that God miraculously intervened. This could be a relationship healing. I think I've heard dozens of stories from this church about how you had a long conflict with somebody that you cared about and God helped you find your way back to each other. One of our JCB students, Titus, drew a picture this week of his own testimony, and you can see it. You can see it here, and it's flowers growing through cracks, and it says, "Healing happens even in the hard places." And so, as I keep talking, I'll invite you in the top right section of your paper to draw a time when you saw God heal something in your own life. I think we need to hear these testimonies, church, because I think we need to remember again that God is still in the business of repairing in us those things that are broken. I also think we need to hear these testimonies because God has also invited us to join him in the work of healing. God's people, if you look throughout Scripture, are never just invited to be recipients of healing. We're also sent to be agents of healing to the larger world that faces brokenness all the time. I know that most of us feel this sense of reluctance around this because the brokenness of the world is really overwhelming, and all of us feel that we have, if we're honest, enough brokenness within ourselves to address for the rest of our life, let alone before we can be useful to anyone else. And yet if you trace through the Old and New Testament, you'll keep bumping into how God calls broken people to the work of healing a broken world. Moses killed a man and didn't really want to lead at all. And yet God called him to deliver his people and said, "I will be with you." Esther was taken from her home and didn't get to choose what happened to her. And yet when the time came, she did what was right and saved her people in the process. Jonah was a prophet who tried to hide from God. How silly can you get? And then was thrown up and reluctantly spoke the message that God gave him. If you read the Bible, you'll keep being confronted by how God's people are called to be healers who are also being healed in the process. Because the paradox of new life is exactly what Jesus said, which is that if we give our lives away, we find it in the process. And so God sends the church out, I think, with two calls that happen at the same time. The first call is to be a community in repair. What I mean by that is that it should be really hard to be in this church without changing and healing over the years. Man, I find that sometimes we in the church see things that are wrong in our own spirit. We're grumpy with people close to us, or we look at everything negatively, or we're hot-headed and angry, and we say, "That's just the way I am." The problem is, if that's not just the way Jesus is, we're normalizing a part of us that won't be with us in heaven. Part of the function of the church as a community is to present to God and confront in each other wounds and shortcomings so that we move toward healing instead of hiddenness, so that we can say yes to Jesus, not just with our actions, but with our reactions and our dispositions and our habits and our instincts and our daydreams, so that even the unconscious thoughts we have can say yes to Jesus's way of living. Some people call that holiness, which sounds a lot to me like wholeness. Having a life that holds together and points with one accord toward the person and the nature of Jesus Christ. I think that's the first call, is to be a community in repair. The second call is to be a community of repair. Counselors and psychologists these days talk a lot about the concept of repair. And it's like the process of intentionally restoring a relationship after a rupture or a conflict or a miscommunication. It's rebuilding a connection of safety and trust and closeness. I read a study a few years ago about discipleship in the home, and the researchers interviewed a few thousand young adults who grew up in church. And the people who conducted the survey said that they were surprised because more than the frequency of family devotions, more than how much scripture the children had memorized, there were two central predictors of whether kids who are raised in the church grow into healthy, flourishing adults who still love Jesus in their 30s. Two central factors the researchers found to be true among kids who found that their faith aged well. The first was how much they experienced kindness in their home. The second was how much they learned to practice repair after a mistake. In other words, did they see the people in their home who were in authority apologize and make things right when they were wrong? Or did they see the people in their home pretend those mistakes never happened? Church, we can do family devotions, and we can pray, and we can memorize scripture together. And I hope we do all those things. And at the same time, sometimes the most spiritual thing we can do for our kids or for each other is to be kind and admit when we're wrong. I saw this at work in a Splash classroom a few years ago. I saw two kids play fighting in the kindergarten classroom upstairs until it was a little bit more fight and a little less play. And one of them got hurt, and maybe I should have stepped in, but unlike Alyssa, I'm not a professional. And so I was sort of just wanting to see what would happen. And so I waited a beat to see what would happen next. And I saw the one kid who started the fight and finished it, as it turned out, go over to the kid who was hurt and say, "I'm so sorry I hurt you. How do we make this right?" And that's such a little moment. But it's lived rent-free in my head over the past couple years because I think it captures a lot of the beauty of this passage from Revelation, which is the simple truth that the same people who do the hurting can also be part of the healing. Our repairing, as small as it may be, joins together with God's repair in the shared project of making the world new. Every time we apologize, every time we turn away from our right to be angry and get curious instead, every time we give of our time or money to help somebody else's dreams come true, even when it only means sacrifice for us, we join God in the project of renewing the world. And so now, I want you to think about where God's calling you to do that. You'll notice there's one more quadrant on your paper that I haven't asked you to draw or write in yet. And that's the one that responds to this call. So I'm going to invite you to get out your paper now and draw in that last corner in the bottom right. Where's God calling you to make things right? Maybe God's calling you to go first in reconciliation or forgiveness, reaching out to someone you've had a rupture with for years. Maybe God's calling you to give of your time or your talent or your treasure to help someone else's dreams come true. Maybe God's calling you to confess something that's true of your personality that is not true of Jesus' personality. Where is God calling you to make things right? One of our JCB students, Clara, sent in a picture of where God's calling her to make things right. And the caption is this: "God's calling me to make things right," she said, "by walking and talking with people that are hurting, specifically some of the people that are close to me." And so, church, I'm going to invite you to draw in that bottom right section what you believe God's calling you to do. And as you're drawing, I'm going to point out something that all the children of the 80s already know, okay, which is that this is carbon copy paper, which is 2 parts, okay? And what you did on that first page should bleed through to that second page. And so I'm going to give you a moment to continue drawing or continue writing. But in a moment as we sing, I'm going to invite all of us from all ages to bring up one of these papers that we wrote on as a physical act of surrender. You'll place one of these papers down here on the kneelers or in front of the platform as an embodied confession that we continue to trust God to carry our world and even ourselves toward wholeness. So part of your paper will stay here at the altar. But I'm going to invite you to keep the other part of this paper for yourself and keep it somewhere that you can see it as a reminder that in your home, in your workplace, in your friendships, you're sent by God with the mission of making things right with God.